Okay, I don't see anything yet. Okay, let me see. All right, folks. I am not sure if we are streaming live right now.
Okay, are we recording?
I am not sure if we are recording, because that's being done from downstairs. So it would be done directly off the Discord. I'm waiting for a message that everything appears to be working. So I figured I would.
I can see the live stream.
You can see the live stream.
Yep.
Okay, so we're live. All right, great. We're live. This is Deacon Joseph Swaden. And this is Orthodox Apologetics Live. It's our second live thing off Discord. Excellent. So if someone can send me the link so I can send that to Facebook and all that fun stuff, and that way we can have as many people as possible involved. Are you on? If anyone's on the YouTube, well, let me see if I can get to YouTube. Okay, perfect. I need that link so that if there are YouTube questions and answers, we can take care of them too. Hold on. Let me see here. It's okay. Give me 1 second. And so, let me quickly just go to Facebook here, and we'll just put this up on Orthodox.
If anyone is listening, I have no echo, I assume, right?
Yeah, I think you fixed the echo problem, Father. So,
all right.
Let me see here. Okay. Give me 1 second.
All right. So basically, we're trying to fix our format for apologetics, right? So.
Yep. Give me 1 second. Okay, so.
Oh my God, for the chat.
Okay, I'm just quickly typing something real fast. And so, other than that, all right, so we're back. I think we're sort of live, it would appear, based on what I'm hearing. I'm going to go to the YouTube page, and I'm just going to quickly mute that because I want to see the chat. And so, hello to everyone who is in the chat, whether you're on Discord, whether you are on YouTube, and we'll get started. So let's take a look here. What have we got? I know there were a few things that came up in the Discord for questions, and that was in, I believe, apologetics real quick. So let's see here. Where's the chat for questions? Okay. Questions. Okay, so there's a question section. So if people want to on the Discord, they can ask questions. If you want to go to YouTube and ask questions, you can do that. We can see it. And so we're live, and we'll be able to answer everyone's questions, concerns, tell us we stand, so on and so forth.
And of course, we will read the question first for people who aren't able to see it. So. Okay,
great. So in that case, so let's see here. See if we've got anything direct so far. Any questions? Let me see. Are there questions? So far, I've seen is arguing from paradigms. That was last week. Arguing from paradigms is not really a traditional Orthodox practice. Generally, we try to refer back to sources of revelation, which would be, the councils and fathers of the church. We don't come up with our own interesting argument, because our own interesting arguments could be flawed.
Okay, according to Wikipedia, a paradigm argument is in analytic philosophy. The paradigm case argument is an argument which is applied as a rebuttal to the claim that certain concepts such as free will or knowledge are meaningless. The paradigm case argument is that if a term such as knowledge is regularly applied to some cases, not to others, then that term and the concept it refers to cannot truly be undefined, as it clearly has some kind of definition in practice, because it often takes the form of pointing out a paradigm case, a case which unambiguously falls under the common definition of the term, and so can be taken as a definite instance of the supposedly non-existent concept. This argument was commonly applied during the flourishing of linguistic philosophy. So this seems to be a relatively late form of argumentation. It comes from analytic philosophy. That's like what, continental philosophy? Or I'm not sure. Is it 20th century? So I guess.
I mean, it's not technically used much in Orthodox apologetics. You can provide common sense examples, but really you should just be relying on the teachings of the councils and fathers. Okay, Mavian asks, do you think Moscow and Rokor will have a schism? Do you that such a thing does happen? Do you think that would leave Rokor canonically isolated, like Macedonia, Belarus, etc.? Well, Rokor traditionally wasn't in communion with the Moscow Patriarchate because the Moscow Patriarchate was a created organization. Rokor was that collection of bishops of the Russian Church who who were outside of the boundaries of Russia. So the reunion in 2007, one would say, it wasn't really a reunion; it was a union. So people are phrasing it in a way that's kind of not how it actually was. Referring to Moscow as a mother church is something fairly new in Rokor history. The mother church was always the Russian Church. Okay, now it's saying you can't hear anything. You may have to do it directly from YouTube, Verum, because the stream room is supposedly it's only for admins. However, if you go into the YouTube, you should be able to hear it. And so this is we're trying to figure out how to make this work on Discord. And one of the difficulties is that if you do a private stream room where it's just us talking, then basically he can't. Okay, hold on. Yeah, thank you, Father Enoch. Yeah,
because we're explaining it to him, he's not going to be able to hear.
He's not going to be able to hear it. Yeah, I get that. So if you're using it that way, okay. So yeah, it works from YouTube, and that's basically we're trying to figure out a way to fix this, so that it can be, that there's some kind of level, a modicum of control. It's not a free open chat. So if that makes sense, it's so we're trying to keep some sort of order, while at the same time taking advantage of the Discord server. But we still we haven't quite figured out what's the next thing to do on that. So we're learning. In any case, hopefully, things are going as well as they can. Let's see. So I hope that answers that question. If Rokor was to go into schism from the MP, which is, the Rokor MP, is unlikely. It's improbable because they're pretty much integrated into the Moscow Patriarchate structure.
Most of the people who would have left already left by 2006.
Right. They either joined with the Rokor under Metropolitan Vitaly, they joined the ROAC, they joined the RTOC, or they left in 2007 with the Union. Under Argafongo, but the point is, most of the people who have left have already left, and they, people who want to join that now can join one of those synods. It's not like they're not going to do that. So, let me see. Are there more questions, or other than that, something about apologetics? Not necessarily. We can talk jurisdictions, but we can. The idea is basically we want to talk about defending the faith, and that's the purpose of this show.
Interesting point to bring up. I know it's further up in the question is how people use and misuse the memory of Father Seraphim Rhodes. And would you like to say something about that, Father?
Oh, well, I mean, the thing is, a lot of people have framed Father Seraphim in a number of different camps, and it's not really necessary to do. At the towards the end of his life, he was friendly towards the Ethno calendarists who became part of the Synod in Resistance. He did not take the Panalamanite position, but I wouldn't say that he was on the fence in terms of ecumenism or modernism or anything historic. I mean, even now, all these things, especially with ecumenism and modernism especially tie into the cosmology of Orthodoxy. And on that, he was solely traditional. So I don't know exactly how much he is, how much you can really say that's, people try to pinpoint, put them in the liberal bag, and I don't think that's fair.
The most I could say is Father Seraphim's views probably essentially agreed with what Mitzvah Kyprianos' views. I guess he seemed to have faith that some of the writings from him from that period in his letter seemed to say favorable things about some of those, what he called moderate old calendarists, but he still agreed with them.
Yeah.
So he wasn't like a liberal and an ecumenist or any of those things. He may have not held. He may have not held necessarily a no grace position, but he wasn't definitely, an ecumenist or anything else.
Well, this is also the period where the Patriarch of Jerusalem was communing with the old calendarists as well. So, because he died in 1983, was it, or 1982? So it's not like, the state of world orthodoxy at that time, despite the attempts this was really in the 80s, was when they tried to make the whole distinguishing between canonical and non-canonical orthodoxy, was not nearly as solid as people try to make it out to be.
Remember the interesting accusation that Father Basil Sakas made against Archbishop Chrysostomus Chiusis in his letter defending Archbishop Maxentius, where he quotes Archbishop Chrysostomus Chiusis saying that he respected the Patriarch of Holy Zion, and he commemorated him, and he asked him to settle disputes with the old calendarists, and that was in fact used to attack the one of the groups of the old calendarists by saying, "Oh, look, he communes with them, et cetera, et cetera." So not to get into the whole the fights between the different groups or whatever.
But the fact that they were actually appealing to the Patriarch of Jerusalem and he was listening tells you something.
Yes. But they did away with him. They came down on Patriarch Diodorus back in 95 or so. Eventually and the fact is, he was already in failing health. His liver was he was having liver failure, and then they took advantage of him the last few years of his life, and they did all kinds of unscrupulous things where a bunch of businessmen made him sign documents, and then they later framed Irenaeus, Patriarch Irenaeus, for all these things, even though Irenaeus was in fact exonerated by the Israeli Supreme Court and the Palestinian Authority, even though they never acknowledged that in any of these publications. But they had to get rid of him because he was kind of at least somewhat resistant to Constantinople.
Okay, now Rambles asks in the Discord, let's go to Mavian first. So how do you tell a Messianic Jewish person who is discerning Orthodox that Judaism is wrong? Well, I mean, if he's discerning Orthodoxy, you tell him Judaism is wrong. You don't tell him Judaism is wrong. First off, because Messianic Jews don't follow the same patterns as most Jewish people. Like, I don't know anyone who goes to synagogue and calls themselves a Messianic Jew. They usually join one of these Protestantized groups.
Well, they have these Messianic Jewish synagogues now, where they do the synagogue services, but they add maybe a mention of Christ or something somewhere.
Okay, that's just odd. Well, you tell them to...
You're thinking, Father Joseph, that Messianic Jews are like the old Hebrew Christian movement?
Like the Jews for Jesus type people.
Them do the Messianic Jewish services too, or charismatic Pentecostal stuff.
Right, but the point is, I think that you have to point to them that Christ established a church. And the point is, one does not become part of the church in a vacuum. So the point is, it's important to note that the Old Testament's fulfilled, and they should understand that, which means you move on.
Another point to bring up is that they have to, when we talk about Judaism now, for all intents and purposes, is Talmudism. And what's called conservative and reform are just liberalizations of Talmudism. That's all it is.
Yeah.
So when we talk about the Old Testament religion is not Talmudism, that didn't even come about in a very proto form unto the time of the first century, and which is what Christ was criticizing the Pharisees for, is in a very primitive form. And many of the synagogue services, not all of them, but a lot of those synagogue prayers, in fact, that they still use in these Messianic synagogues, were invented in the 2nd and 3rd century to contain curses against the minim or other people, which is a code name for the Christians. So because I can tell you that what happened to the original synagogue services when they were taken into the church back in like 40 AD or 30 AD, they became the liturgies, the various Eastern and Western rites of the church. They turned into that. So there's no really need to have take a Jewish synagogue service which developed outside and in fact in antithesis to the church. and to use that. And when there are already liturgical rites in the church, which developed, in various centers, which were, so. But that's kind of the.
Now, let's see. Now, how many sacraments does Rambles ask? How many sacraments does Orthodoxy hold to? Many, like Metropolitan Ware, say that the Church Fathers didn't believe in 7. Callistus Ware claims that 7 sacraments was Latin influence on the Church. Metropolitan Ware even claims that St. John Damascene only believed in 2 sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist. I sincerely don't believe that St. John of Damascus only believed in 2 sacraments. That's not a valid claim. I think that, when you're talking about the 7 sacraments again, and I've mentioned this previously, I'm not sure if I did it on the show or not, but the idea of the 7 sacraments being a Latin influence comes from the fact that they are answering in response, the Roman Catholics were answering in response to Protestants. But insofar as those sacraments or mysteries are in fact sacraments, and were mysteries, Orthodox went along with the enumeration, even though they considered other things to be sacramental. And when we talk about the sacraments or mysteries, we're talking about where God touches mankind. That's what the sacraments are for. So I don't know that the church will limit it to 7 sacraments, but at the same time, I am not against the 7 enumeration simply because those are in fact 7 real sacraments. You can't.
And we do have dogmatic. We do have proclamations like from the Synod of Jerusalem and others about the 7 sacraments and such. And that may have been and a lot of that, like you mentioned, was the fact that the Jesuits and others were coming in attacking Orthodoxy, and so the Orthodox said, "Well, we do believe in 7 sacraments," and that doesn't mean they were necessarily taking Roman Catholic teaching, but they were replying to Roman Catholics, if you know what I mean, Father.
Yeah.
Like, for example, he mentions St. John Damascene saying only baptism and Eucharist. Well, the problem is that in St. John Damascene's time, which was basically, 740 Syria, Antioch, baptism was given with chrismation. So sacrament of chrismation, mystery of chrismation would have been included in baptism. I'd have to look at the exact quote they're using. That's probably from book 4 of the exact exposition, probably near the end of it. But you can say that baptism, which includes chrismation and the Eucharist, are basically the 2 sacraments people need. When a baby's baptized, then they're baptized and they're chrismated and they're given the communion.
Well, yeah, that includes the chrismation. But even as far back as St. Augustine, there's no doubt that chrismation was considered a real sacrament of the church.
Yes, absolutely, yes. In fact, you can find things from the 3rd century, like Hippolytus, and even the witness of Tertullian, even before he left the church, from the 200, about the anointing with chrism, and St. Cyprian of Carthage and other figures and such.
So it's important to not look at these things in isolation, but always look at them in the background of how the Church Fathers see them.
And again, like you mentioned, Father Joseph, I believe the enumeration of 7 sacraments in the very, very late Scholastic, probably the early Reformation period, was what, like you said, the Roman Catholic reaction to the Protestants claiming this or that, right?
Well, that would be 16th century, because they were literally saying only baptism and the Eucharist can be considered sacrament. So I think that Callistus Ware is just wrong. Again,
Verum Fidei says Father Hiram McKennick wants the original sourcing footnote for this quotation in the 860 condemnation of Pope Nicholas in the West. That I think he's quoting the condemnation that's found in, I'm going to read it in a second, but I think he's referring to a condemnation by 2 Belgian archbishops. And that's in Father Vladimir or Abbé Guitte's book, Papacy. I think that's where it's from. The quotation is, without a council, without canonical inquiry, without accuser, without witnesses, without convicting us by arguments or authorities, without our consent, in the absence of the metropolitans and our suffragan bishops, you have chosen to condemn us of your own caprice with tyrannical fury, but we do not accept your accursed sentence, so repugnant to a father's or a brother's love. We despise it as mere insulting language. We expel you yourself from our communion. Since you commune with the excommunicate, we are satisfied with the communion of the whole church and with the society of our brethren, whom you despise and of whom you make yourself unworthy by your pride and arrogance. You condemn yourself when you condemn those who do not observe the apostolic precepts, which you yourself first violate, annulling as far as in you lies the divine laws and the sacred canons, and not following the footsteps of the popes or predecessors. He is quoting from a letter by 2 Belgian archbishops to Pope Nicholas. And if you want to speak about, I can look it up real quick, I guess, if you want to talk, Father Joseph.
Yeah, that's fine. Looking for that. The problem, one of the things is that in the period where Abba-Gute was writing in the 1800s, at times, although Abba-Gute's sourcing, Father Vladimir's sourcing, is usually, it's impeccable. Occasionally, footnotes were kind of skipped at times because of the fact that it was assumed that certain things were known among the community in which they were
Hold on
writing.
a second. Can Verum Fide, can you give me the page number so I don't have to search for the book? Page number for that quotation in Abba-Gute's The Papacy.
And Rambles, I'm sure that, I have no doubt that Metropolitan Callistus wrote those things, and I still have no doubt he's still wrong. I'm not sure what I'd be checking to, I'm sure he's going to probably quote something out of context.
If anything, you probably find cases where the fathers would, the word sacrament or mysterium would simply mean a lot more than 7. For example, they talk about the mystery of the Holy Trinity, or the sacrament of faith, or something like that. So,
well, it just says St. John of Damascus, on the other hand, thinks in terms of 2 chief sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist. St. Dionysius speaks of 6. Basically, he's enumerating a list of different numbers that were used, but even then, he says in terms of 2 chief sacraments, which means he recognizes other ones, and I'm sure that a lot of fathers would have no problem with referring to baptism and the Eucharist as chief sacraments. But the point is that doesn't mean that the other things are not sacraments. So that's a little bit of legal sleight of hand there that's going on. So I think the 2 archbishops he's talking about, one was the Archbishop. I want to say the Archbishop of Cologne. That's not Belgium though. I think one was like Archbishop Tuberger or something like that. And that's interesting. I'm trying to recall. I think Archbishop Hingmar of Reims, the Annals of St. Burton, which you can buy an English translation of. He talks about the case of these 2 archbishops and how a lot of the Belgian bishops and some of the bishops, I think they were Belgian bishops. It says here the archbishops of Treves and Cologne.
Okay, not Belgian bishops. And what page is it on?
Well, I'm looking. I just copied copied part of the link, and I found it in this Nova Scriptorum that says the Fall of Orthodox England, and it just has a foot. It does have a footnote, but I guess they copied it out of the book, and they copied the footnote, but they did not copy the actual footnote.
As I recall, what happened to them is that in the 870s or 880s, I think it may have been the 880s, to those 2 archbishops, is that they had, I'm going off my memory here, because I haven't read the Annals of St. Burton for some time. But I think what happened is that after one of the reunion councils with Constantinople and Rome, one of the decrees of the reunion councils was that the East would recognize all the previous depositions, save the ones that were against St. Photius, etc., that had been carried out, and they would not receive anybody who had been deposed by the Pope and his bishops in the West. So I think those 2 bishops actually had to make some kind of apology, but they made some kind of weird apology where they didn't quite.
I can see looking at the papacy online. It's page 137. Abba-Gute basically notes what the archbishops of Treves and Cologne say, but he does not include he doesn't include a sourcing for that. But would be interesting to find. Possibly, I would guess that your actual yours.
Page 137, you say?
I'm looking at an online version. I can send you which version I'm looking at. You'll see what I'm talking about.
Anyway, I think what happened to them is they both had to, in the 880s, because they had incurred the wrath. See, they had also incurred the wrath, those 2 bishops, later of Archbishop Hincmar of Reims. And they kind of lost his support, which meant they eventually themselves got deposed. And that was why kind of many popes in the 850s and 60s and 70s and 80s always tried to stay on the side of Archbishop Hincmar of Reims. Like there was this attempt in the 884, 882 or something like that, in which there was a council held in which Pope John VIII and some of his legates had wanted to raise, I guess, the Archbishop of Sens or something like that to be primate of all Germany and Gaul. But the German bishops were like, we don't accept this, and no matter what the Pope John VIII said, they would not accept it. But the source again is from Archbishop. I'd have to go into the Patrologia and find it.
Well, let me see. I'm going to try something here because I'm going to try to see if I can.
Well, I can see if I can find my copy of the Annals of Certain Burton. I can actually, it's upstairs, but I can do a Google search of it.
Well, I found an essay where it was copied, and it may have a reference there, but I'm checking real quick. Quoted in Abigute. Okay, so you see, this is the problem with secondary sources quoting secondary sources. While Abigute is a quality source, unfortunately, it's not the ultimate source, which comes to the actual original text. So this is a case where that becomes circular because everything is quoting off Abigute without.
Okay, so one of them was Archbishop Gunther of Cologne.
Okay.
Okay, I'm trying to find the document about him. He apparently at one point he incurred the wrath of Archbishop Hincmar because of this whole case of, as I recall, the divorce of King Lothar and his remarriage. Anyway, so Archbishop Gunther had supported it. Hilduin was maybe the other archbishop. And what's interesting is that Nicholas kind of like anathematized them, but they and their bishops just continued to celebrate Mass. And in fact, Hincmar got so upset at them that he says, in the Annals of St. Burton, he says, a few days later, the emperor left Rome. His following had committed many acts of devastation there, destroying houses, raping nuns and other women, killing men, and breaching the privileges of the churches. He's referring to one of the German emperors, I guess. He reached Ravenna, where he celebrated Pascha in an acceptable manner with respect to God and his apostles. That very Good Friday, Gunther had reached Cologne and presumed godless man to celebrate Mass and to consecrate the sacred chrism. Theogaud was the other archbishop, however, showed proper respect and abstained from his official functions as he had been commended to do. With the cooperation of the other bishops of the court, Luther deprived Gunther of the archbishopric. So what happened is that I guess King Luther had at one point been persuaded to turn against them, and then they basically got deposed. But that itself is interesting, but what's also interesting is the fact that they would presume to say these things to the Pope, because obviously they believed he was wrong and they could say these things, even if...
I think what we can best summarize, then, Verm, is the best way to find these quotes is to find the historical context of when these things were written. Usually the easiest reference point is to find who were the archbishops at the time, and you'll usually find the story behind it, and that will actually help you find the things in the Patrologia Latina. You have to, that's really what it comes down to, is to find things that you can't historically source. You actually have to look at the history, look at the time period, and then look at where you would find information on that time period. So hopefully that helps. I don't think we're going to go through the entire Patrologia now to do that. Jordan Paul then asks, what was the traditional method for training those preparing for holy orders before the advent of theological schools? Did it vary by synod? Do any synods still follow or allow this method of training? Well, in true Orthodoxy, that's actually way more common than uncommon because, especially in foreign countries, there usually aren't established seminaries. In a lot of countries, it's not done. Even in Greece now, sometimes the old country, reader will get ordained just because he knows all the services, even though he's a farmer. Yeah, and so that's, it does. It does vary by synod. It also varies by need.
I believe also there used to be a custom among the, for example, like when a Patriarch Macarius of Antioch in the 1650s, when he visited Russia, he talks about that when a new priest was made, they would, for example, when they would take, in fact, he mentions when uniates would come back, would convert to Orthodoxy, they would be sent to a monastery, and after they were ordained in an Orthodox church, they would be made to celebrate liturgy 15 days in a row so they could see whether if they knew how to do everything correct.
They would test them on the 40 days?
Well, he says that for the unions, they only made them celebrate liturgy 15 days in a row.
Well, that's just to make sure they actually knew what they were doing.
Yes, and I think that's because their unions had maybe introduced various deprivations and corruptions into the Byzantine liturgy.
So it's just a way to fix it, yeah.
Generally, what they would have is a priest would celebrate 40 liturgies in a row.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned,
that's the best liturgical training for a priest you can really get.
Petition. But remember, the traditional method was someone would be made a subdeacon when they were 20, okay? And they would simply serve with the priest, and they would be taught gradually by, reading by the services, listening to the services, hearing sermons, and reading separate books, and having kind of like a director, maybe the bishop or one of the archpriests appointed over them. And after 5 years, they would be made a deacon. And then they would spend the next 5 years until they were 30, get continuously learning the services and also being taught in somewhat of an informal manner until they were ordained priest. Though I should mention, in Russia, they established seminaries basically in the Russian Empire beginning in the late 1600s. And that's why in the 1700s and 1800s, the vast majority of Russian priests still were sent to seminaries.
Yeah.
And that's why you had even like people like Metropolitan Philaret of Moscow, or other figures were like ordained priests when they were like 23 and such, even below, that's far below the canonical age. But one of the reasons they did that was Russia was simply so spread out. They didn't have a priest visit except for maybe once a year. So, like Patriarch Diodorus, not Diodorus, but Patriarch Dositheus, he was made a bishop when he was 24. I think he was made a priest when he was like 20, because simply, they needed what were considered educated people, or they needed actually priests because the unions were taking people from them. So, now, anyway, that goes into other issues, but so was the traditional method for preparing these as training for holy orders before the Advent? So the traditional method before this theological seminary was you had informal teaching, if you might say that, from your own priest and your bishop and your archpriest. And you basically learn from them over several years. And they would give you books, and they would, works of the fathers, and you would read through them. You would, celebrate the services with your priest on a regular basis. And kind of by osmosis, for lack of a better word, you would kind of learn things. If you understand what I'm saying, Father, right?
Yeah, no, I agree.
I should also note in Constantinople, though, back in, they did have, quote, religious, theological, he used the word theological, but theological schools up until the 1500s. They did, in fact, exist in Constantinople. I mean, maybe not out in the countryside, but in some cities they did have catechetical schools, they sometimes called them.
Yeah.
They did teach people in formal ways. And a lot of people who went there basically never got ordained. Maybe they were made readers, but not everybody who went to these kind of proto-seminaries in Byzantium. A lot of them were just what we call lay theologians, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
They just were lay people who wanted to learn a lot about the Holy Fathers and the ancient church and the ancient canons and such, and they were taught them. So, I guess, okay.
No, go ahead.
Rambles 17 says, any saints that were canonized, the old calendar Orthodox reject. Well, any saints that are canonized, we accept, that are canonized by a true Orthodox synod. So that's kind of begging the question. You mean, are there any saints canonized recently by, let's say, the new calendar or the official patriarchates that we accept, the true Orthodox old calendar accept?
Well, I think it would be reject, he says. And I think,
Reject, I'm sorry. I didn't
these,
say that.
some of these new elders were very suspicious of,
Some of them, for example, Father Paisius Enzepitus and Father Porphyrius, some of them had originally been non-commemorators or even true Orthodox, and they were eventually persuaded in the 70s to kind of leave. And that's kind of, or they became, they went back to the commemorating the ecumenical patriarch in the 80s, and they died like 7 or 8 years later. And that's kind of one of the reasons they got promoted, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like, for example, Elder Sabas, who was always one of the oldest of the non-commemorator elders, and he was always, I think he was aligned with the Orthodox, obviously. He, in fact, back in 1989, wrote a very, very public letter to Elder Porphyrius, or either Porphyrius or Elder Paisius, when he went to commemorating the ecumenical patriarch, saying that, he basically made this great fall. But, for example, let me try to think. There are, people like Elder Porphyrius, Elder Paisius, we would not accept. There's this Moscow Patriarchate saint named Luke the Physician, we would not accept. There was this Elder Lawrence of Chernigov that is a very interesting figure. A
lot of true Orthodox kind of respect him because of his prophecy.
Here's the thing. they later made up prophecies about him to attack the true Orthodox. For example, back before like 1998, no one heard of Elder Lawrence's prophecies about how you have to reject the Free Russian Church and anybody who refused to come.
No, that's all new stuff. That's not. But then they do this with Saint Seraphim of Sarov too. There are whole books that are written by his alleged disciples of words he said. And so that's I don't want to cast aspersions on the saint because of false things that people have written about him later.
Claim is that Elder Lawrence of Chernigov had been I think actually associated with some of the early catacomb churches.
Yeah.
But there was this event that happened like 1948-49 where supposedly they convinced some of the this is where the Moscow Patriarch claims the catacomb church ended in 1948 when they all rejoined us or something like that. And what happened was that there was this attempt back in the post-World War II period to kind of loosen up, at least from the outward appearance, the Communist Party's control of the MP. And they did have some of them join him, though there were some of them who got, for example, like Schema Bishop Peter Ladigan. He never joined the Moscow Patriarch. Even though some of the Moscow Patriarch respected him, he died like in 1955, and he always would never commemorate, I guess it was Pieman back then. And he always claimed he was part of the Catacomb Church. Now, he was blind, and they kind of found him in like this old shack, and they kind of like, for lack of a better word, like took him and put him in an apartment, but they could never convince him to do anything with the Moscow Patriarchate. And that's one of the reasons they haven't been able to find some way to canonize him in the MP yet, although he's accepted by like Artak and other groups as a saint. Most of these are like newer people, I'd say, Father Joseph. I mean, you're talking about people in the 1990s. The Ecumenical Patriarchate did, quote unquote, canonize St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mount in 1955, but we had accepted St. Nicodemus as a saint. People in Greece had accepted him as a saint on Mount Athos decades before that.
Yeah. Silouan the Athonite, again, you're talking about someone, didn't he die like 200 years ago? I mean,
St. Silouan died like in 1940, I think, didn't he?
St. Silouan the Athonite?
Hold on, St. Silouan Athonite. You're thinking of St. Nicodemus.
Okay, yeah, you're right.
1938. Yes, in 1938. He was canonized by the Thanar, apparently in 1987. Now, my understanding of him is that he was respected by people in the Royal Court, and there were people who venerated him. So I've heard positive things about him.
Yeah, I don't think
I don't really know much of. Pardon me.
I don't think he was that controversial or anything.
I know that one of his disciples who later left and founded a monastery was Father Sophrony, and he kind of created. He was much more controversial.
I think one of the problems is that glorification.
Because Father Sophrony basically, I guess, tried to imply that Saint Silouan the Athonite believed in the apocatastasis or something like that, but there's a dispute about whether that's in fact Father Sophrony's words about him or actually Saint Silouan's actual words.
One of the biggest problems that is
just one more thing. There's a book about Silouan the Athonite. Half the book is in fact the translations of the diaries of Saint Silouan, and the other half of the book is Father Sophrony's commentary. So don't mistake the commentary by Father Sophrony in the 1980 for the actual works of Silouan. So anyway, I'm sorry.
Well, it's just Jordan Paul's asking the question because the Abbey has him on the calendar, but he was glorified by the EP. As I said, the best policy is always, I guess you could say, is openness, and basically, when the St. Hilarion calendar was written, it consulted a lot of sources, and this was before there was ever really a dispute. There was never a really big dispute over the proper method of glorification, which didn't really start until, after the 90s with the fall of communism and the MP trying to reassert itself, and we start getting all these false stories, so on and so forth, because glorification followed a set process. And so many of, if you reviewed the lives of many of these saints, et cetera, and they were okay, they were inserted into the calendar. And so this is, that to me is not a problematic thing in and of itself. I don't think that most of the new saints that are being introduced are not introduced into calendars of true Orthodox. But I don't think that, a lot of the new stuff that you're going to see coming from this or that elder about this or that saint is real, because it's not in a lot of cases. It's just there's new stuff created about this. Now, about Rochor's canonization of St. John Maximovich, our Metropolitan was present at that glorification, so I would hope that he recognizes it.
As a guest, he just stood in the nave. So
yeah, but the point I'm trying to make is obviously he wouldn't have gone there if they didn't exactly invite the Roman Catholics over or anything like that. As for St. Nicholas II and his family, those glorifications took place in 1982, before it was way before any talk of union.
It actually fell on new calendar Halloween Day back in 82 or 81 or something like that.
So the point is that we accepted glorification of saints that were considered traditional. We still do, if they were following the faith and they had no points of dispute in that sense. So it's not like granted, it's not our responsibility to glorify all these saints. That's not our job. But the point is that,
for example, Rochor glorified St. Nicholas of Japan, in 1985 or 1978 or something like that?
Like 1991.
No, it was in the 1980s. It was they did it at a church in Pennsylvania.
Oh, okay.
We accepted. There were people calling St. Nicholas of Japan even before that. A lot of times people were calling St. John Maximovich before 1994.
And it's important to remember also that when St. John Maximovich was glorified in 1994, a lot of World Orthodox didn't recognize it. So,
in fact, people forget there were people in Rochor who still did not want to glorify St. John Maximovich because they personally like, for example, Archbishop Anthony of Los Angeles and even Metropolitan Vitale. They had very negative memories of him, and they only agreed to it at the last moment. Now, they say Archbishop Anthony of Los Angeles actually had a vision where St. John Maximovich appeared to him, and then he accepted him as a saint after that, which actually I'm inclined to believe happened. If you know how Archbishop Anthony of Los Angeles had been negative, he actually took St. John Maximovich to court, was one of the witnesses trying to basically put him in jail back in the 60s.
Yeah.
So for example, also there was this attempt in the early 1990s when it became almost a fait accompli that St. John was going to be glorified officially. They began to try to clean up the history of what had happened to St. John in the 1960s, in the 50s. They began to say, he really wasn't persecuted. It was just a misunderstanding. He really wasn't taken to court. He really never said people were trying to kill him, or that if he shows up dead, it's because they've killed me, which you find that a lot in his testimonies. Because it was embarrassing to a lot of people in Rochor, if you know what I mean, Father Joseph, what they had done to him.
Mm-hmm.
And these people were still around, and they got to the point where they had to accept. Now they had to accept him as a saint. Hopefully, it wasn't just for political reasons, but some of them, I believe, they generally had conversions about the sanctity of the man. Because, you had some of the bishops back in the 50s and 60s basically saying St. John Maximovich was imprelous because he walked around barefoot. He walked around barefoot until he stepped. I think he was in San Francisco or somewhere, and he stepped on a needle and he got an infected foot. And I think Metropolitan St. Philip had to basically order him, saying, look, you have to wear shoes or sandals from now on. You cannot do this. I think Archbishop Anthony of Los Angeles, who criticized him a lot, basically thought St. John Maximovich was, a show-off, and he was making an appearance of piety, but he was really like this, crazy, insane guy and things like that. People despise St. John Maximovich also a lot because he supported Western Rite. They did not like him for that. There was an attempt. St. John Maximovich supported the putting of St. Ansgar on the calendar. St. Ansgar had reposed back in 820 or 830, I believe. He was the apostle to the Scandinavians. And St. John Maximovich's view was that he's already a saint. We can just put him on the Russian calendar since we have churches in Europe. And there were people who were trying to say, people were trying to criticize St. Ansgar and say he wasn't really a saint. And St. John Maximovich's point was that if we have Saint Wenceslaus on the calendar, and he was basically, he was in communion with many of these people, then there's no reason we can't have Saint Ansgar, since there's no evidence Saint Ansgar attacked, Constantinople, or said he was just an apostle from the 780s up into 820s to the Danes. And he kind of won that battle, but whenever St. John Maximovich kind of won these battles or eked them out, Even if the people were defeated, they still held a lot of animosity to him, and they kind of destroyed a lot of his work after he passed away. And what remained of it was basically what Father Joseph in San Francisco and a few other places. But he did have a lot of disciples. So, but we accept those canonizations, obviously. A canonization, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Father Joseph, is just simply a recognition of the Church of what's already a fact.
Yeah, I mean, I prefer the term glorification because canonization kind of has a formality to it that comes from the Roman Catholic process with beatification, so on and so forth. Glorification, it was just simply insertion into the calendar with a liturgy celebrated.
In fact, it wasn't until like the 980s or 1000 AD that was the first time a Pope of Rome glorified or canonized somebody like outside of his diet, outside of Italy or outside of that immediate area.
Yeah, it was a very late development.
Yes, because generally what happened is someone was a holy man, a priest or a bishop. He would pass away. He had a lot of disciples. People would start claiming miracles. His disciples would say, "This man's a saint." Everybody would agree with it. Within a few months, his name would be on or a year, his name would be on a calendar. That was generally how it happened.
Yep.
Okay, so
Sean is asking in the chat and YouTube how to get copies of the Patrologia Latina. I'm explaining it's 120 volumes, but here
it's the Patrologia Latina is like 220 volumes. Only about 100 of them we would actually use because they go up to the schism. And the Patrologia Graecia is like 90 volumes.
Yeah. So, but either way, if you're looking at $30 each,
it would be about $10,000 to get all these books all together, probably.
Exactly.
I mean, for example, you can download them PDF format if you want to.
Yeah, he really wants the I guess the physical copies. The better option would be to actually use something like I know that Google and the Internet Archive, they usually connect to these print-on-demand services, and then you can print out specific editions or volumes that you want.
Notice they're in Latin or in Greek, so they're not. You don't have any translation into English.
Yeah. Now, Rambles asks, what's the position of Old Calendar Orthodox and the Salvation of World Orthodox? Well, I prefer the term True Orthodox because there's a lot of World Orthodox on the Old Calendar, like 75% of them are. So I don't, it's not like it's us versus new calendars because new calendars are a tiny minority when you look at it worldwide. But if you're asking what the position of the True Orthodox is on the World Orthodox, I'd say it's the same position they have on us. Which, frankly, they consider us to be outside the church because of they claim schism, and
you can explain it the same way. The views range between, just like the World Orthodox view of us, that there is no salvation for them, to God will somehow save them if they honestly believe they're Orthodox.
Timer asks, what is our eschatological view, and are there any differences with the World Orthodox? Well, theoretically, there shouldn't be.
Eschatology, by eschatology, do you mean things like our view of the afterlife up into the resurrection, or do you mean eschatology in the generic sense people use it today of like the end times? Like
end times, because that would be soteriology, but
sometimes eschatology has a reference to what happens after you die. Yeah. Sometimes. Okay, so, technically, among the more conservative circles of the World Orthodox, they would probably agree with us that there's going to be an Antichrist, and the Antichrist will be Jewish, coming from the tribe of Dan. Maximovich teaches that, by the way. St. John de Damascus, I think you can find it in St. Hippolytus, you can find it in several fathers.
Lots of fathers.
Yes, that's this generic view.
Yeah,
they will be between
Israel.
The Jews are so there's between a 3.5 to, this is where it gets, first off, let's say what we don't believe. We don't believe in what's called a pre-tribulation rapture or a mid-tribulation rapture.
Right.
Right. You're going to be here. If you're going to be alive, you're going to be alive through that time. If you're not, assuming you're not caught by the Antichrist and you give in to him, or you're killed, or you die before it happens. Okay. There is some. If you look at St. Hippolytus's commentaries on Daniel and on Apocalypse back in the 3rd century, he seems to view that there's going to be a 7-year period before the end of the world from the time the Antichrist first comes about. Now, some say there's going to be 3.5. There's this whole discussion among the fathers about how to interpret the days of Daniel. Now, some say that, now, hold on one second. Some say that, like St. Hippolytus, I believe, and others say that the last 3.5 years is going to be really when the Antichrist power comes to full fruition. The first 3.5 is when he's going to be building things up. There are 2 witnesses described in the book of Revelation, which the fathers interpret almost universally, except for 1 or 2 cases. But in generally, the patristic consensus is that these 2 witnesses are the holy prophets Enoch and Elias, who, as of this point, have not physically died. They will come back, and according to the fathers, the prophet Enoch who is my patron saint, he will go to the Gentile, the non-professing Jewish world, and he will preach the true gospel, the Orthodox gospel, and the Antichrist will attempt to slay him, but he will not. He will be divinely protected. And the prophet Elias will go to those who claim they are Jews, and he will preach the gospel to them. And St. Gregory, the dialogist, in his book called The Morals on the Book of Job, I believe in some of his sermons on the Gospels, states that only at the end will the Jews, and now St. Gregory the Dialogist's view is that the Jews as a whole, not saying all the Jews, but as a recognizable people, will, under the influence and in the miracles of prophet Elias, look upon him whom they have pierced and mourn him as an only begotten son, as the prophet says. And that they will, in fact, repent of all their evil deeds and their blasphemies for 2,000 years, and will accept the true gospel. And that many other people will accept it. So, in fact, there will be no excuse near the end times when these prophets are going around the world for what is the truth. Everybody will have a chance. Because the gospel will preach into the ends of the world, and then the end will come, as it says in the scriptures. And people will endure through this. There will be the Antichrist, who will be a ruler. He will, at one point, there's a discussion among the fathers about what does it mean that he will stand in the temple of God, which I think St. Paul talks about in Thessalonians. Some fathers say that means he will try to set him up in a false Orthodox church, a physical false
I thought it was going to be that coronation would be in the Temple of Jerusalem.
See, this is my point. That's one view. The other view is that he will rebuild the Jewish temple, which I believe is the correct view, and he will stand in that, and now some say he will go into the Holy Sepulchre and proclaim himself God. That's what it means by the temple of God. But they seem to generally view that the Antichrist will be accepted by many Jews as a messianic figure before the coming of the prophet Elias. So there will also be a false prophet. You find it like St. Mark of St. Hippolytus talks about. And the false prophet will basically be the religious leader of the Antichrist. And he'll have kind of like... Now, some of the Russian new martyrs, Father Joseph, and you may remember this, they actually say that the Antichrist, when he comes about, he will allow those who call themselves Orthodox to do all their services exactly as they want, as long as they do not oppose him and they do not publicly attack him or say anything about him. So, that way he can deceive people and such. So I don't know if I've kind of given you a general view of the eschatology.
Do you think the Antichrist might be a Jewish pope? It's unlikely the pope will bow to the Antichrist. Didn't St. Mark of Ephesus call the Pope Antichrist? Now, you have to keep in mind that Antichrist has 2 meanings. You are either talking about Antichrist generically or the Antichrist. Now, keep in mind that even in the epistles, St. John says that there will be many Antichrists. But there's many Antichrists and there's the Antichrist. So
the last great Antichrist.
Right. Big one, I don't think the Pope would be the big one. He'd just be a type of the big one.
Now, it's interesting is that the Roman Catholic Vatican religious structure is basically the center of ecumenism in the world. It's possible the Antichrist might use that to set up his false religion with a false prophet. That could work. I mean, I could see that happening.
If they don't collapse first.
Might pick up the pieces. Now, I'm going to put a link from the works of St. Hippolytus, which have some of these commentaries in them. It's the fragments from the commentary on the book of Daniel, I believe. There's a commentary from Genesis. There's a Scholia. Okay, so Scholia on Daniel. I'm going to put this in the chat. And this should contain some of St. Hippolytus' writings, which basically talk about, it's a very broad view. There's going to be a 3.5 to a 7-year period. The Antichrist will come. He'll come from the tribe of Dan. He will deceive the world. The prophets Enoch and Elias will come, and they will preach the true gospel. Many Jews, some say many, some say most of the Jews, we don't really know, will repent, truly repent. There will be at least some portion of them that will repent. Prophet Enoch and Elias at the last will come into Jerusalem, and they will be finally slain by the Antichrist, And then 3.5 days later, I believe according to the book of Revelation, they will actually be resurrected and then assumed into heaven.
Yeah.
And then near the end of that, when it seems as if like everything's like, the darkest, it's always darkest before the dawn, and it seems as if the Antichrist power has reached its summit and the devil is going to win, our Lord Jesus Christ appears, and as the apostle says in Thessalonians, I think it's Thessalonians, he shall come and with the breath of his mouth will destroy the Antichrist.
It'll all take place in the blink of an eye along with the judgment.
Yeah, and in fact, when it says we shall all be changed in the blink of the eye, that's talking about, if you want to talk about a rapture, that's happening, that's the resurrection. When all those who are alive are caught up, that's talking about when everybody, who is still alive shall be, will be caught up, and they'll be changed into the resurrected bodies. And then the dead will be raised, who have died, and then everybody will have a resurrected body, and then the last judgment happens. And our Lord then assigns people who were faithful to new heaven and new earth, heavenly kingdom, and those who did not follow him, who rejected him, will go into the lake of fire forever.
Now, maybe the false prophet is the Pope. This one
he is a false prophet, I guess.
A false prophet. I don't know. We don't know about the false prophet, but he's definitely a false prophet. Timer asks, is ecumenism a precursor to the Antichrist? It majorly seems like it, but I'm a mere layperson. A lot of people have said that it's definitely a good candidate, as in that it combines all of the false teachings of the world's religions in one. It's definitely unique in the history of mankind.
It's a unique heresy because previous heresies, like the Arians, the Nestorians, the Macedonians, the Monophysites, they each claimed to be the true church. They were heretical about their ecclesia, about their Christology or Trinitarian views, which made them not the church. But the Monophysites were like, we are the true church. They weren't trying to be ecumenical, if you know what I mean. That was why when the Orthodox would combat the Arians in the fourth and let's say the fourth, fifth, then into the 5th and 6th centuries, and let's say Arians would be converted in Spain, like Visigothic Arians would come over to Orthodoxy, they could be accepted with some few months of training into as a layperson maybe, or even shorter, as long as they accepted that Christ and the Holy Ghost are God, and they rejected any distinction of Arians, because the Arians still believed there was such a thing as the true church. The dispute was who is the true church. Now the strange thing about ecumenism, or almost the pan-heresy aspect, is that it's this teaching that denies there is such a thing as the true church, which is so strange in history. It denies the fact that there could be heresy.
Yeah.
What makes it so strange, so distinct from all of the other previous heresies in history? And it's mainly, to be honest, ecumenism is really mainly something that kind of came out of branch theory Anglicanism, and was combined with modernism. In the 19th century, it kind of also, you have ecumenism coming out of Protestantism in the Great Awakening in the 1700s, when they began to say, all you have to do is have faith in Christ, and then all these other doctrinal differences don't matter. Because even before that, the Calvinists would be like, we are, correctly the true church, or the Lutherans, would say the same thing. But this whole ecumenical mindset was gradually emerging in Protestantism. I think it was only logical that it would happen in the 1700s. And it was manifested into Anglicanism, and through Anglicanism, it basically tried to implant itself by various contexts in the late 19th and early 20th century into Orthodoxy. Any other questions we have? Any other subjects to talk about?
No, I think we're actually good here. Wow. Okay. Well, if we're going to look at that, I would say probably not right off the bat. But does St. Jerome's letter 15, section 1 and 2 support papal supremacy? Well, again, context. St. Jerome.
What's the letter? It's a letter to Pope St. Damasus. Now, let's remember here, St. Jerome was not in communion with the Patriarch of Jerusalem at the time, the Bishop of Jerusalem.
Right. Okay?
St. Jerome, in fact, did not even recognize St. Meletius as the legitimate Bishop of Antioch.
So this is not a typical case in any...
St. Jerome, into his dying day, would only commemorate the Pope. I think he maybe began to commemorate St. John of Jerusalem, like in the 410 or something like that. But okay, let's look actually through sections 1 and 2, because I can guarantee This is not what the thing says.
Yeah, it already starts out with, since the East, shattered as it is by long-standing feuds, subsisting.
In other words, St. Jerome doesn't want to take any particular side, although he does take sides. Okay, it says, since the East, shattered as it is by long-standing feuds, that is, not feuds necessarily between the Orthodox and the Arians, but these are feuds actually between the Orthodox fighting each other. Since, for example, you had the Orthodox Apollonius of Antioch, who basically were not in communion with the Orthodox of St. Meletius of Antioch, and they in fact claimed that St. Meletius' baptisms were invalid. He was basically a heretic. So St. Jerome says, since the East, shattered as it is by the long-standing feud subsisting between its peoples, is a bit by bit tearing into shreds the seamless vest of the Lord, woven from, now this is written in 376, by the way, okay, so before the Second Council, woven from the top throughout, since the foxes are destroying the vineyard of Christ, and since among the broken cisterns that hold no water, it is hard to discover the sealed fountain in the garden enclosed, I think it is my duty to consult the chair of Peter and turn to a church whose faith has been praised by Paul. So let's stop here for a second. What St. Jerome is saying here, St. Jerome is saying that not only are the heretics attacking Orthodoxy, but the Orthodox in the East can't even agree among themselves to be in communion with one another. And he says you cannot determine which is the, he says, and since among the broken cisterns are holes in the word, it is hard to discover the sealed fountain. So in other words, his view is hard to discover who of the Orthodox groups are actually canonical in his opinion, and which are uncanonical, which are schismatic, and which are not schismatic. So in that case, St. Jerome thinks, being a Latin, by the way, from Italy, his view is that, he's going to consult his own native patriarch. All right, since Rome at that point his view had not become heretical.
Oh, it gets even better.
Appeal for spiritual food to the church whence I received the garb of Christ. Okay, that makes sense. I think he was made a monk maybe in Rome. I'm not sure. I think he was baptized there at least. So the wide space of sea and the land that lies between us cannot deter me from searching for the pearl of great price. Wheresoever the body is, there where the eagles be gathered together. Evil children have squandered their patrimony. In other words, the Orthodox in the East have fought amongst each other, and so at that point, St. Jerome says, you alone keep your heritage intact. In other words, Orthodox Rome had not descended into disputes and fights among each other. Yeah, so his view is, let me appeal to the Orthodox Pope of Rome, since the Orthodox in the East have begun to fight each other. The fruitful soil of Rome, when it receives the pure seed of the Lord, bears fruit 100-fold. But here the seed grain is choked in the furrows, and nothing grows but darnels or oaks. In the West, the Son of Righteousness is even now rising. In the East, Lucifer, who fell from heaven, has once more set his throne among the stars.
That's an interesting reference, because it wasn't, if I remember correctly, weren't the Luciferians the party during this period?
Yes, this is there was a group called Lucifer. They weren't demonic.
No, they were named after Bishop Lucifer, but my point is that's a reference to a living bishop.
Lucifer of Cagliari, who St. Jerome basically, I think he believes he died in schism and heresy. But Lucifer of Cagliari was the one who, in fact, consecrated. He was originally allied with Rome, and he did a single-hand consecration of Paulinus of Antioch. And thereafter, Rome and Alexandria had to accept Paulinus of Antioch, which meant at that point that they could not accept St. Meletius of Antioch. But Lucifer, who fell from heaven, that's interesting. Maybe, like you say, a reference to the fact that Lucifer Cagliari later was considered to have won the schism by St. Jerome. Although in Cagliari itself, the ancient Liber Pontificalis of the Church of Cagliari from like the early medieval period actually claimed Luciferus did in fact repent before he died. Anyway,
St. Jerome would have known that.
Yeah, exactly. Has once more set his throne above the stars. You are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. You are the vessel of gold and silver. Here are vessels of wood or earth, which wait for the rod of iron and eternal fire. 2. Yet through your greatness, yet though your greatness terrifies me, your kindness attracts me. For the priest I demand the safekeeping of the victim. For the shepherd the protection due to the sheep. Away with all that is overweening. Let the state of Roman majesty withdraw. My words are spoken to the successor of the fisherman, to the disciple of the cross. As I follow no leader save Christ, so I communicate with none but your blessedness, that is with the chair of Peter. So in other words, St. Jerome is saying that he's not even in communion with any of these Orthodox groups, like St. Meletius of Antioch, all right? And he's not in communion with St. Cyril of Jerusalem. For this I know is the rock on which the church is built. This is the house which alone the paschal lamb can be rightly eaten. This is the ark of Noah, and he who is not found in it shall perish when the flood prevails. But since by reason of my sins I have betaken myself to this desert which lies between Syria and the uncivilized waste, I cannot, owing to the great distance between us, always ask of your sanctity the holy thing of the Lord. Consequent. Now that's interesting. What is the holy thing of the Lord? I think it actually may be probably chrism he's asking for. He doesn't, because he wouldn't accept chrism from any of the Orthodox bishops around him, because St. Jerome's view at that point was that he would only communicate with the Western Orthodox.
And he literally says that right after this.
Yeah. Consequently, I here follow the Egyptian confessors who share your faith and anchor my craft under the shadow of the great glories. I know nothing of Vitalis. I reject Meletius, that's Saint Meletius. I have nothing to do with Paulinus, that's Saint Paulinus. He that gathers not with you scatters. He that is not of Christ is of Antichrist. Okay, so I don't know how much people can actually make of this, other than the fact that St. Jerome's view is that I don't want to be associated with any of these bickering and fighting jurisdictions who anathematize each other and refuse to be in communion with each other, even though they claim to have the same faith. And I'm just going to only commemorate Pope St. Damasus. And
yeah, I don't see it. I don't, it depends.
Now, what's interesting, it's interesting he mentions Paulinus of Antioch, because technically Rome was in communion with Paulinus of Antioch.
Well, this is something that I should point out, that this is a good example of a quote being taken out of context. If you understand the confusion in this period, then you can clearly label what parties he's referring to. But if you aren't familiar with the people in this period, then it just sounds like he's rejecting random people. He's talking about Satan as opposed to an actual bishop. And it becomes a much more pro-papal letter because you don't understand what you're reading. So it's important to get the background information to make it clearer. And we're going to, we should start winding down, but we're going to take these last questions.
Notice now, interestingly, the next section they don't talk about, because that's talking about St. Jerome, where he's actually attacking. He says those Arians in their unhard formula of three hypostases. You know who St. Jerome's talking about there? He's not talking about actual real Arians. I think he's actually talking about the Cappadocians, because St. Jerome regarded a lot of the Cappadocians as really Arians. Now, they weren't, but because they were ordained, in his view, by Arians, if you know what I mean,
Yep.
or by semi-Arians or crypto-Arians. He basically, St. Jerome's view is that the Cappadocian formulations were kind of a suspect theologically, which is why he had nothing to do with St. Meletius or St. I don't even think he shared communion with St. Basil the Great. St. Jerome, in fact, to his dying day, if you look at his chronicle, he regarded St. Cyril of Jerusalem as basically a fraud. And he would have nothing to do with him. He would never commemorate him. And part of this may be the fact that St. Jerome, where he lived in Bethlehem, had all these different parties coming to him and trying to get him to celebrate with him or somehow interact with him. And people also stole his library books, too.
Okay, so I hope that answers your first question, Rambles.
Even if you look at the third section, that's getting into St. Jerome basically overreacting and trying to criticize the Cappadocians, where he's actually trying to label them Arians, which they're not. So.
And Verum Fide says, Eric Ibarra makes the claim that in 861, the Greeks under Constantinople affirmed to the papal legates that the Pope had the right to intervene and override Eastern Council. Well,
this is this question where he's claiming that St. Ignatius never said, I do not appeal to Rome, I have not appealed to Rome. And I asked on the Orthodox Apologetic forum, I don't think I ever got an answer, is Siasinski is quoting that, but where is the actual reference to St. Ignatius? Because Theognostos, who was the, as I recall, was basically the partisan of St. Ignatius, was the one who in fact went to Rome. Now they claim that Theognostos did this without the support, permission, I guess, of St. Ignatius, but there was other aggrieved bishops who had been deposed that went to Rome, and they got Nicholas involved to begin with. Now, and now no one disputes Theognostos and other bishops did that. The question is whether St. Ignatius actually said he appealed to Rome later or not. But the problem is that if Nicholas actually, I'm not defending Pope Nicholas, but I'm just going on the Sardican method. If they actually felt there were Eastern bishops appealing to them about a dispute, then it might be a little bit more complicated. They're trying to show that there was no appeal, that Pope Nicholas just went there out of nowhere, heard something was going on, and he just sent in people showing up, and they got involved in it proactively. That's the claim. But I've not seen any evidence about this.
Now,
other than suspect secondary sources that never give a primary source, which is always kind of weird.
You have to look at the primary source. Rambles asks, what about St. Irenaeus saying that you must agree with Rome? We have covered this at length on the War Zone. There's been debates over the term Potior and Principalitem. Saint Irenaeus in this text, if you look at the chapter before and look at the chapter after, is establishing the canon or rule of faith by which you establish orthodoxy. And one of those things is the apostolic succession. If we look at section 2 by itself, and we misinterpret the Latin, we're able to say that maybe it says, it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church on account of its preeminent authority. But if you look at section 1, it is talking about the formation of churches because the apostolic succession was a way of refuting the Gnostics as whether or not they were actually part of the church. So section 3 goes through the succession at Rome. Section 4, and it points out that, it points out to the church in Smyrna and the church in Ephesus being true witnesses of the tradition of the apostles, and then it attacks the false churches of the heretics, which do not have the succession of the apostles. It's a misreading of St. Irenaeus to assume that he's saying you must agree with Rome. What he's saying is you must agree with churches of the apostles, including Rome, which is of the Blessed Peter and Paul, and Smyrna and Ephesus. He's talking about the apostolic succession, churches that had the sanction and the succession of the apostles. And again, the Gnostics didn't have that. They were claiming some sort of false connection to false gospels, such as the Gospel of Thomas, so on and so forth. I don't know if you have any.
I'm always when people, even the statement. Well, what is the actual statement Saint Irenaeus says?
Well, no, he does say you must agree with Rome in terms of the succession. So if we go to that actual,
what section is it?
It's section 2 in book 2, chapter 3, and it's paragraph.
It says, since, however, it would be very tedious in such a volume as this to reckon up the succession of all the churches, we do put to confusion all those who, in whatever manner, whether by an evil self-pleasing, by vainglory, or by blindness and perverse opinion, assemble in unauthorized meetings. We do this, I say, by indicating that tradition derived from the apostles of the very great, the very ancient, and the universally known church, founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, also by, quote unquote, pointing out, or in brackets, the faith preached them, which comes down to our time by means of the succession of the bishops. For it is a matter of necessity that every church agree with this church on account of its preeminent authority. Okay.
To me, that doesn't sound like that. I don't see. He's even saying basically the only reason that the reason that we would agree with this church because of its preeminent authority, or I would say its preeminent principality, is that ultimately because you could assemble all the churches that were founded by the apostles and you could put them together. But that would be a very, very tedious task. So just to answer these heretics, we'll point to the tradition at Rome.
I should ask that technically they would have, even in the 2nd century, Rome had a proto-patriarchal kind of jurisdiction, even in Italy and in Gaul, I believe.
Yeah.
So that would have been his patriarchate of sorts, if you know what I mean.
Well, even though he anathematized Pope St. Victor. So
you're right. So this is another interesting point, exactly, because when Pope St. Victor, because he excommunicated the Minor churches, because of Quarter Decimian, not heresy, but error, even though technically St. Victor was right, St. Irenaeus' view was that he was wrong to do what he did without the consent of the entire church.
Yeah.
Now it's interesting.
So he would be contradicting himself.
Yeah, unless you interpret the word.
If we took that interpretation, effectively, that would mean that he's saying you must agree with Rome, except I don't.
Exactly. In other words, a matter of necessity that every church should agree. That does not mean in an absolute sense, certainly not a Pastor Aeternus sense of Vatican I.
Yeah.
It's like referencing the scriptures where they say, be obedient to your parents in all things. What if your father tells you to go murder somebody or to go break the law? No, of course not. I'm sure Saint Paul would have said, stop asking stupid questions if you think I meant that.
Yeah, and then so now we get to the next one, which is Jordan Paul. This is an abstract question, but what do you think is holding back conservative world Orthodox from becoming true Orthodox? I saw that several priests stopped commemorating their bishops in the wake of the 2016 Creed Synod. Do you think this trend will continue? Probably. This is really, I think you've mentioned this is kind of the third wave of non-commemoration. So until, their house gets in order, this is not going to stop. And it's not because of anything we're doing. It's because of what they're doing. They're the ones innovating, so people are going to keep stopping them.
I heard once, about 15 years ago, from a priest who was one of these priests under Elder Ephraim in Arizona. And his view was that ecumenism was, in fact, the reason it took over, he said, was the fault of the old calendarists. Because
we left.
They left. But what's interesting is that, even in Greece, they were about 10 to 15% of the population. And they all got deposed back in the 30s, even before they left. So it's not like if Metropolitan Chrysostomos and the two other bishops had stayed, they could have turned everything around, because they had conservative bishops who basically were sympathetic, but they basically did nothing. So, I mean, this is always the kind of the thing where people say, oh, if only so-and-so had stayed in the marriage, they could have saved, could have saved it or something.
I'll tell you the biggest thing, biggest reason holding them back, I hate to say this, is fear. The biggest thing that holds back movement is always inertia. And the simple reality is, if you're a conservative world Orthodox, you feel comfortable, but at the same time you're bothered by ecumenism. Fighting from within seems the most natural thing for you to do. It doesn't require you to do much, is my point.
Now, interesting. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go please.
Interesting point. Several years ago, I was at a restaurant, and this is not about an world Orthodox or anything. It was about this older man who had a conversation with. It was like a Chinese buffet years ago, and he was interested in religion, and he was interested in who we were, and I explained, and how we were traditional Orthodox and things. And his brother, this guy was like 90 years old. He was in pretty good shape, and his brother, I guess, was like a Roman Catholic priest who was like a few years older than him, or something like that. But he was still apparently retired or whatever. And I said, well, what does your brother think about all those things, how the Roman Catholic Church has become extremely modernistic and liberal and ecumenistic? Does he agree with all that and such? And he said that, he says no. In fact, his brother said that he never agreed with any of it. He never agreed with, but he just he never agreed with any of it. He thought it was, in fact, his brother said his brother was a Roman Catholic priest, thought it was heretical, but he just didn't know what else to do, or that if he didn't want to leave, or he was afraid of losing his livelihood. I think there's a lot of that going on too, Father Joseph, where people have uncomfortable jobs. I'm giving that as an example, but that's more than just happens in more than just Roman Catholicism. If you know.
Right, but the point is, it goes back to inertia. I mean, if a person has a church and a salary, they probably figure that they can do more than risking it all. And that's kind of the mentality that they have.
I mean, if you leave like the Greek Archdiocese or the OCA as a priest, you leave having a paycheck, probably a house, having friends. Everybody turns against you in your former body. Hardly anybody, maybe some, but everybody will write nasty emails to you. You'll be written up in one of their church periodicals as this evil schismatic, vagante. They'll do everything to destroy and ruin you.
Yep.
And then they'll tell their children, if your children are going to Holy Cross or some other college or whatever, they'll give them problems. They'll call them and say things to them. It's a lot of them. In fact, I know a few people who've joined us over the years, or other Orthodox jurisdictions, and it's the same thing happens to them. They try to destroy your life. In fact, I know one case of the where somebody tried to take one clergyman's daughter to court to have her children taken away from her, claiming that she had joined a cult.
Wow.
And and so now they didn't success to the judge was like, this is ridiculous. He knew better. But it shows what they're willing to do in some cases and how people are afraid to do something. Not just losing their jobs. They'll really go after you. Everybody you met, everybody who was friends with you, said nice things about you on Facebook or whatever, and they suddenly become opposite.
I want to stress something here, because a lot of our listeners are obviously, they're not clergy with investments and so on and so forth in their lives in world Orthodoxy. And if you don't have that level of investment, so on and so forth, a clean break is the easiest way of dealing with it. A lot of our older and more successful clergy made that break when they were young. They didn't have to deal with that. You don't have to deal with all of the baggage that you're carrying when you don't have it yet. So the point is, I think that when you even look at most of the conservative world Orthodox leaders who are non-commemorating, they're already older people. They don't want to be kicked out of their monasteries. They don't want to push it too far. The point is, that's what's holding people back. It's fear. And so if you don't have that problem, then I say I would just Go to true Orthodoxy first.
Now, this is what, before I go on to the other parts of that question, because it has some other points, this is one of the things I liked when you read this, you read accounts of the Athonite monks and elders in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s, and 70s, up into who were the original non-commemorators and became the core of the true Orthodox movement, or church, I should say, movement. But in the 20s, it was a movement, and then we became a distinct synod in Greece, as we had to distinguish ourselves, to separate. But a lot of these Athonite monks and elders kicked them out. I mean, they were like living in shacks on the side of a mountain. They had the bare necessities. Maybe some of them weren't even priests. They were like digging latrines for themselves. Maybe it may sound disgusting, but maybe they took a bath or bird bath once a month or whatever, because they're just living out in the woods like mountain men, literally mountain people, holy mountain people. Some of them became hieromonks. And what could be done to them? That was how they were thinking. That was the original way of thinking. If you're trying to persecute some guy who's a hieromonk living in a shack, and you're like, what are you going to take away from him?
Exactly. There's not much you can take.
And they didn't care. But what happened is once in this, that's what happened to Athos. Once in the 60s and 70s, the so-called New Holy Mountain Fathers, and money started flowing in. And then they started turning all the monasteries into, literally were turned into 5-star hotel rating monasteries, except for Isfigmenu. Once that began to happen, people had all these nice monasteries. Everything was well taken care of. You weren't living in an old house, and, you had all this investment. And then the New Holy Mountain Fathers came in, and, it changed things. And then what happened is the monks, the Athonite monks who had the old spirit, they lived out in their, caves and shacks.
They still do.
Yeah, and they still do that, yeah. I mean, Isfigmenu, I think, doesn't even have any electricity.
No, it doesn't. There's a
And-
blockade against it. But the point is, many of them do live in those shacks, and they
I mean, it's not saying that, and I'm not saying that you have to agree with every single opinion, because different Athonite elders will have opinions about different things that are not theological. I mean, one Athonite elder may say this, who's true Orthodox, another may say this, who's true Orthodox, about how to, penances or whatever. But my point is that that's kind of this spirit where they don't fall under the spirit of the world, if you know what I mean. And if you have that view, and if you don't care what people are going to say about you, and you're willing to take all kinds of slings and arrows, and you're not going to also want to try to turn yourself into some sort of a pseudo martyr, but you're just going to say, I'm going to do what Christ asks. And it's just like the 3 children. When Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to bow down to the image, and they said, look, God is able to save us, but if God chooses not to save us, no, we're not going to bow down to the false image. Now, I saw that several priests stopped commemorating the bishops. Do you think this will be a trend? It might be a trend. I think that in the Moscow Patriarchate in Russia, they kind of stopped doing, after the Havana Declaration was what generated, that was before, it was in early 2016, I believe, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was shortly before the Greek Synod.
Yeah, that was what caused all the non-commemoration movements to spring up in the MP places on Mount Athos, as well as in Russia itself, and even caused, technically, I think Archbishop Longinus, who was this Archbishop in Moldova, or Ukrainian Moldova or something.
Yeah, under the MP.
Yeah, I think he had already, either he ceased communion at the Havana Declaration, or he'd done it a few months before, though he kind of, anyways, this weird situation. But I think he later kind of came back to commemorating whatever. But, what Kirill said, supposedly, if you read kind of the religious news, was that he agreed in spirit. This is what, in fact, Archbishop Longinus says, of Longin, says in Ukraine, who was like, who was arguably the most conservative of all the Moscow Patriarchate bishops possible. He was the most prominent one who was a non-commemorator. And they did not try to depose him, by the way. They knew what would happen if they had tried to depose him. It would cause many people to leave. Because then they'd have to take him to trial, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
12 or more bishops, and they'd have to say why you're not commemorating the Patriarch, and then he'd start bringing up stuff. So they were kind of politically savvy about not getting rid of him. And also because he was famous because of the orphanages he built. They made him like this bishop of this nobody created diocese that nobody wanted. That's generally how like really extreme conservatives will get in, like Diomede Trukata, or whatever.
And then he
because
became a worshiper.
Yeah, exactly. Well, he went into exactly. That's and he became problematic for other reasons. But someone like a Longin, he kind of got successful because he was in a nowhere diocese that was just made, and he was basically someone who built it from the ground up. And I mean, I don't agree with him being EMP, but he was not an evil person, is my point.
Yeah.
And he basically got respect in a way that a lot of the Moscow Patriarchate or New Catholic, other bishops, even to Orthodox bishops, a lot of them do not. Exactly. And so they could not go after him, and they had to negotiate with something with him. I don't know what it is. His website's still up where he attacks the Patriarch all the time. So I don't know what they negotiated with him where he was in. But he says that Patriarch Kirill said to a meeting of the MP clergy, which is that he agreed in essence with the Cretan decrees and there was nothing wrong with them, and he recommended them to be adopted. But there was pushback where people were saying, if we do this, it will cause some sort of a break among a lot of priests, and maybe one or two bishops, but mostly a lot of monasteries. And so they weren't willing to do it. It wasn't because they disagreed in theory with it. Because you look at the Havana Declaration, it's basically saying there's sister churches is the papacy and all this other stuff. Yeah, and you know, it's, as Father Tikhon Kazunskit, retired Orthodox priest who's in like Serbia or whatever, he made this point that Kirill kind of makes kind of this very soft ecumenism he does, although Havana Declaration is not soft.
No.
Where Hilarion Alfeyev is allowed to basically say and do whatever he wants and actually express Kirill's views. So when everybody attacks Hilarion, they can always say, well, it's not the Patriarch saying it, it's Hilarion Alfeyev. But he is like the spokesman for the Synod. All right? So will it continue? I think they're trying to clamp down on it. There were some abbots at St. Sergius, Trinity Lavra, some of the Higumens that had ceased commemoration, and I think they got kicked out, where they tried to make it not newsworthy when they did it. They're very political about it because they know if they start kicking all these non-commemoratives out who are still living in monasteries, doing their own liturgies in their own rooms or whatever private chapels they have, then they're going to have a situation on their hands, the likes of which they haven't seen for basically since the 1920s when Sergius started doing his stuff. Now, the other part of the question is also you discussed the Arian crisis before, but what are some good sources on the ecclesiastical situation during the Iconoclast period? If you can find the Acts, not just the Urban series, but the full Acts of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, there are two translations. There's a free translation made in the 19th century, which is a good translation, I believe.
It has a lot of the Protestant footnotes.
Yeah, it's by an Anglican who has these really snarky footnotes about orthodoxy in it. If you can disregard the footnotes and just read the text, then you have a full translation for free. Especially the first session. The first session is really important to read. You can also buy what's his name? The guy who translated the Council of Chalcedon in the Latin. Price did a translation, but that's like $120 if you want.
Yeah, it's better to get if you're looking for on the cheap. You just ignore snarky footnotes from Protestant.
Just ignore the So I would encourage that there. I think there are some Lives of the Saints, maybe from Dunbarton Oaks. There's the Lives of the Saints of Patriarch St. Teresius, maybe a few others in Dunbarton Oaks translations, Byzantine series, where they have the Lives of the Saints during the Iconoclast period, and that's really important to read because you get the feel of what was happening. What people oftentimes forget, and I've heard this over and time again, they say, well, Iconoclasm was a heresy, but the other patriarchates were still in communion with them. And well, first off, that's not true. Just like when people tried to say St. Athanasius was in communion with Arians and he didn't break with them, so we shouldn't break with humanists. First of all, St. Athanasius was not in communion with any open Arians. If they were Arians, they were still secretly. All right? They made point to Eusebius and Nicomedia, or even Eusebius of Caesarea, but technically people forget Eusebius of Caesarea, even though he was a crypto-Arian, he publicly accepted the Council of Nicaea. These people only near the ending of St. Constantine. Because during St. Constantine's times, the Emperor St. Constantine would hear nothing about the rehabilitation Arius. He, in fact, did not like Arius. What's true is Eusebius of Nicomedia, who was outwardly Orthodox, all right? He was up into 337. He was outwardly Orthodox, so he was still part of the church outwardly, even though he was secretly a heretic. Was trying to insinuate himself with Constantia, the sister of St. Constantine, and trying to say, well, Arius was misunderstood. Maybe we need to hear it again without and every time they would be bringing this up to St. Constantine, he would I don't want to hear nothing about this. This guy is condemned. I just don't want to deal with it, And so after St. Constantine dies, it's at that point, who was St. Constantine's successor? One of his sons, Constans or Constantius or something like that. At that point, the Arians are like, well, now that Constantine's dead, now we can come out. And at that point, they began to do stuff like depose St. Athanasius for sorcery. They claimed they deposed him because he cut off a guy, he murdered a guy, he cut off his head, and he used sorcery. And then when St. Athanasius was able to produce the guy who they claimed he had murdered and done black magic with, rituals with his hand, St. Athanasius had his hands covered, and then he uncovered the guy's hands, was like, well, where's, his hands are here. And then the Arians said, oh, you're black, you have such powerful sorcery that, you resurrected this guy. I mean, it was crazy stuff. So first off, St. Athanasius got deposed by them, all right? At that point, once they got rid of St. Athanasius, they could start creating things like the I can never pronounce creed, which was like an Arian creed. They went full on. You had Acacius of Caesarea, who was St. Gregory Nazianzen, called the tongue of the Arians. In fact, St. Gregory said, I do not even want to pronounce his name. All right? These were people that St. Athanasius, I'm not in communion with them. St. Athanasius did not recognize the Arian George of Laodicea, who was put into Alexandria. He would not conciliate with these people. So this concept that he was with them, first off, that's totally false. Another point to make out is that for the Iconoclast period, it was a little bit more straightforward, actually, than what happened during Arianism. Because there were parts of during the Arian heresy and crisis when you had people like the Cappadocians who were part of these, what are called the conservative semi-Arians. And by semi-Arians, I don't necessarily mean Macedonians. There were groups of bishops in the East who did not agree with Arius, but they were very uncomfortable with the term homoousios. This is like the second generation after Nicaea. And many of them became outright Arians. Some of them agreed with Arius. Some of them did not agree with Arius, like St. Gregory, St. Gregory Nazianzen, or St. Gregory Anice's father, St. Basil's father, etc. But these people were still considered essentially, for lack of a better word, part of the Arian movement by St. Athanasius in Rome and Orthodox Alexandria, because they would not break with them. All right? Now that break did happen, by the way. Back in the 360s, once you see St. Meletius, there's this new kind of movement that happens with St. Meletius and the Cappadocian Fathers, where there's this clean break with them and all this other stuff. But though they necessarily weren't in friendly terms with St. Athanasius' communion of bishops, because, for example, the whole question of Marcellus of Ancyra and all this other stuff. For example, St. Basil the Great talks about in one of his letters that when his deacon Dorotheus went to Rome to try to negotiate a communion with Rome, in Rome they basically were like, why do we want to talk to you? You're basically an Arian. Because you were ordained by people who, we consider to be deposed or heretics or something like that. And then they attacked St. Meletius a whole bunch. And St. Basil's, I think, recognized St. Meletius as, I think maybe recognized him as his patriarch, because he was, Asia Minor, part of it was under Antioch. Anyway, it was a more complicated situation in that situation in the Arian crisis. But in the Iconoclast period, in 729, I believe, or 730, and then in 731 in Rome, under Pope St. Gregory II and Pope St. Gregory III, you had two councils. And each of these councils and two letters anathematized. There was one council kind of condemned iconoclasm, because what had happened is that the emperor, I don't know, was it Leo the Isaurian?
Where is that Seventh Ecumenical Council?
Go to Google Books and type in the Second General Council of Nicaea or something like that.
Okay, hold on. Let me see if I can find the link.
So, but just to explain how it's a little bit different, and this is what I'm trying to explain that book. So St. Gregory II hears about Patriarch Germanus. St. Germanus is basically uncanonically expelled from Constantinople, from his see, because the emperor wants him to condemn icons. And the emperor basically then appoints a new bishop with basically kind of some of the other Byzantine bishops. And then Pope St. Gregory II condemns this and condemns iconoclasm. And then he writes a letter to the emperor condemning it. And then again in 731, he condemns iconoclasm in a much more formal way. This council in 731, as I recall, was held on November 1st on the old calendar. Obviously, there was only one calendar. This is actually the reason in Rome they moved All Saints' Day from a date in May, which was the original dedication of the Pantheon was dedicated to like the chapel of Our Lady, the Church of Our Lady and All Saints, but they moved it to November 1st due to the 731 council, because there was a kind of this either a very large chapel that was attached to St. Peter's Basilica, I recall. Which what happened is that the representatives of the iconoclast emperor showed up in Rome, And they're like, the emperor has ordered all icons and images to be removed, and you can no longer venerate them. And so when we come back, we expect there to be no more icons in any of the churches in Rome, no images whatsoever, no incensing of anything. All right? Well, the big St. Gregory the Second or St. Gregory the Third, if you read his letters, they're comical in a certain sense, but they're also very brave and wonderful, because when the representatives come back, St. Gregory invites them in, and it turns out St. Gregory III had made even more mosaics everywhere. He had restored even more church. In fact, St. Gregory erected a secondary choir screen in front of the Templon screen in St. Peter's Basilica, upon which he attached large silver engraved in gold icons of our Lord, Our Lady, the saints. All right? And in fact, he had dedicated, and when the legates arrived, he held a council in 731. The imperial legates arrived, and he dedicated the chapel, Church of All Saints there, Chapel of All Saints. And, that was like the original anti-iconoclast council, or the second original one. And that's kind of the unknown reason of one of the reasons November 1st kind of took place. Precedence of the old All Saints Day in May. And at that point, Rome was no longer in any communion at that point with Constantinople until 787. They were done with it. Similarly, I can't give you the exact dates, but in the 730, I think in 732, around 731, Antioch also had its own council. Antioch had another council like in 747 or something like that, I believe, which again anathematized Constantinople. But around 730 to 733 was when all the patriarchates, like in Rome, Alexander, Antioch, and Constantinople, and Jerusalem, broke with Constantinople. At that point, the Byzantine emperor wanted to impose, and all the iconoclasts, because who were the theological iconoclasts, began to use imperial authority to basically expel Orthodox bishops, those who were not apostatized to iconoclasm. This is in fact what happens in Greece. In Greece, southern Italy, and Sicily, and in Macedonia and parts of Dalmatia. These areas had originally commemorated the Pope as the Patriarch, although there was this power-sharing agreement with the Ecumenical Patriarchate when it was Orthodox could kind of help consecrate or administer the areas. But at this point, those bishops in these Roman areas, these originally Roman jurisdiction areas that would not accept iconoclasm, were expelled, and they had to flee to Italy if they weren't killed, and heretics were put in their place, or if they did accept it, they apostatized. And the emperor the iconoclasts couldn't really do much to Antioch, Jerusalem, or Alexandria because they were out of the territory. But the iconoclast emperor violently threatened to kill the Orthodox in Italy. In fact, there's an event happened. It's either in the 729 or the 731 letter of St. Gregory II or St. Gregory III, or it transpires is rather amazing. St. Gregory II or III, these two letters, he says in one of them that there were Lombard and even Frankish legates that had arrived in Constantinople to venerate the relics, and the emperor brought these few women who had stood up for the Orthodox faith and murdered them in the presence of the Lombard and Frankish representatives and Roman representatives. And the implication was that I can send my armies to kill the Lombards and the Franks and any people in Rome who will not accept iconoclasm. All right? So now this is interesting because people forget there have been a lot of negative ill will generated in Italy and in parts of Gaul toward Constantinople because Constantinople had originally been monopolized. That kind of got repaired by the 670s as Constantinople moved to becoming Orthodox again. When this happened, and then the emperor began to, and his iconoclast patriarch began to threaten the Orthodox and Orthodox Franks, Lombards, and Italians. They were at that point. It was very difficult to go back once basically the Byzantine emperors threatened to invade Lombardy and Gaul and basically start killing your people unless you destroy all the images. Okay. There was also now what's interesting is I recall Cyprus. Interestingly, I think maybe in the 740s, 750s, had attained a quasi-independent status from Constantinople. And as a result, and I'm going off memory here, Cyprus never implemented iconoclasm. In fact, the Cypriot bishops, as I recall, did not commemorate the Patriarch of Constantinople because they considered him a heretic. But the emperor and his iconoclast allies, iconoclast patriarchs, they were not able to impose their will on Cyprus because Cyprus was just too militarily powerful, had a navy, and the emperor did not want to have to invade Cyprus at the same time he was having to fight, I don't know, the Slavs and the Muslims. All right. So this is why, for example, I think Patriarch Saint Tarisius, or either Paul IV, who was like the one who kind of recanted Iconoclasm in 785. One of them actually was originally came from Cyprus, and then they kind of became an iconoclast in Constantinople, that was kind of their explanation as to how they kind of had an easier transition back to orthodoxy. I think if you read some of the Dunbar Oaks translations, they do have Lives of the Saints. Generally, as I recall, again, I'm going off memory here, so please look up these books and read these texts. The vast majority of all the bishops in Byzantium either apostatized to iconoclast heresy, or if they would not accept it, left. In fact, many priests simply just left and went to Italy. And at one point, one of the reasons they don't talk about, and this is very strange, Romanides kind of doesn't talk about why Pope Saint Zachary actually sided with the Merovingian and then the Carolingian kings. It was because the iconoclast emperor was threatened to come there. Rome was basically right near Byzantine southern Italy. It was just able to maintain its independence. The reason Pope St. Zachary supported the Frankish king to have overlordship of Rome is that he didn't want the Byzantine iconoclast army marching into Rome and then basically killing him and his people and destroying all the churches. Because that was what was going on, believe it or not, in southern Italy. People were they were imposing iconoclasm in southern Italy. Now it's interesting. Even people like you have these Anglican bishops who were essentially iconoclasts in the 17th century, like Bull and Usher and other ones. They will say in their works that even though they defend iconoclasm or semi-iconoclasm, whatever, they will tell you that the iconoclasts were very, very poor and violent people. Poor Christians, not poor physically. So most of the people who are going to be resisting iconoclasm that exists within the confines of the Byzantine Empire or the apostate Patriarchate of Constantinople are going to be basically monks and it's always going to be the monasteries and lay people who basically who can say, well, if they don't have much invested, they can simply say, well, I'm just going to leave and go off to the mountains and such. But if you read the first session of that book, again, don't look at the footnotes. The footnotes are by this kind of Protestant, he attacks the council. But if you can look at the translation, the first session has very important information because it explains, also, if you can read the Chronicle of Theophanes, I don't know if you can find that on Google Books, it's called the Chronicle of Theophanes, that contains a lot of important information about how Constantinople came out of its heresy and schism. And what had happened is that Patriarch St. Paul IV, he wasn't saint at the time, around 785, he comes to this conviction that iconoclasm, and remember, he'd originally been Orthodox, I think he'd been raised in Cyprus, and then he becomes an iconoclast, and he moves to Constantinople, or he becomes iconoclast in Constantinople, something like that. And he comes to this realization that, look, we're in heresy. We're in schism. This is not the true faith we've done. Look at all the evil things we've done. We've separated from the church. And the Patriarch Paul was like, I can no longer celebrate liturgy because I don't even think he knew if he was celebrating a real liturgy. All right? He doesn't even know if he's really a true patriarch, was really consecrated a bishop. Because remember, at this time, most of these Byzantine bishops have been consecrated by apostate schismatic heretics who have been consecrated by apostate schismatic heretics. So the line of grace-filled apostolic succession had actually ceased. They may have this outward form, which heretics and schismatics can have, but the grace had stopped since probably the 730s or something like that, since they were cut off by all the church as heretics and schismatics. And so what happened is the representatives of the empress, I think St. Theodora was St. Theodora, and the emperor and the imperial senate, they come to Patriarch St. Paul IV, or Patriarch Paul IV at the time, and they say, well, what's going on? What should we do? And he says that Patriarch Paul IV says, we are in schism and heresy. We are separated from the apostolic thrones of the four apostolic sees. He's talking about Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, Jerusalem, and Rome. And we have been in schism and heresy for some time. And he says, I cannot in good conscience continue anything. And they say, what should we do? And they say, we have to restore communion with the church, and we have to recant of our schism and heresy. And at that point, Paul IV retires to one of the Orthodox monasteries that had survived. And he basically, that's how he becomes St. Paul IV, because he basically lives his last few months in the pious repentance and is accepted as a saint by the church for that. And so he essentially comes back into communion with the church as just a simple monk, by the way. At that point, Patriarch St. Tiresias is elected. But you have this 2-year period in which Constantinople is in this kind of like hazy zone. The Patriarch is technically not iconoclast outwardly. So if he's not outwardly a heretic, he's at least a schismatic, all right? And the iconoclasm has kind of been on the wane, but it's not been formally renounced by all the Byzantine bishops. So at this point, they have to hold a council to bring the Patriarchate of Constantinople, or the pseudo-patriarch. It's not a real patriarch. It's not part of the church. They have to readmit them back into the church. And that, in fact, is what the whole first session discussion of the council is about. Because the Orthodox monks, the monks who had never apostatized for decades, who never accepted, being in communion with the heretics and schismatic Constantinople, basically began to argue with Patriarch St. Tiresias, and they say that you cannot accept ordinations of heretics. Therefore, the ordination that Tiresias was ordained by apostate heretics, schismatics who was ordained, and so, etc., since the original heresy and schism in the 730s. So the monks were arguing that, I think they may have at one point even argued they didn't even want to accept his baptism, or the baptism. They could, technically they'd have to accept the baptism of St. Tiresias, or at least St. Paul, because they may have been baptized in Cyprus, but a lot of them, they were like arguing about the baptism. And so now what happens at the end of the conclusion, or near the end of the discussion, is that St. Tiresias then presents an argument as to why, under certain circumstances, the church has economy to accept the outward form of the ordinations of heretic schismatics. And he brings up very rightly the case of St. Meletius of Antioch. And he points out that St. Meletius of Antioch was originally consecrated, pseudo-consecrated by heretic Arians to be the Bishop of Sebastia. I think he was consecrated under the authority of Acacius of Caesarea. And of course, this was not a real consecration. He was devoid of grace. It had just the form. But the question is, at what point does St. Meletius kind of get the grace back? And there's this general view that when he outwardly professed orthodoxy, I'm not sure how it's all figured out as to who he went into communion with or whatever, who was really an Orthodox bishop, he kind of became Orthodox. I guess that would be like in 362 or something like that. That's a whole other discussion. So by the end of the council, at the end of the first session, the monks, having been presented as evidence, then agree that yes, we can accept the ordinations of heretic schismatics under certain circumstances, although the monks were against accepting the ordinations of the original heretic schismatics, but most of them had died back in the 730s. So the concept is just for the sake of acrovia, they would not want to accept the ordinations of who was like the original iconoclast patriarch back in 730, I can't remember his name. The original leaders they would not accept because they felt that would have been granting them too many favors. So that's kind of how that ends. And because you got to remember, if the demands of the Orthodox monks at the council have been met, and they have been like, well, all these Byzantine bishops are going to have to be rechristmated. Maybe we can accept their baptism by economy, but they're going to have to be chrismated for the first time, and then new Heraconians from the ground up. What would have happened is a lot of people simply probably would have not wanted to go into union back with the church again. And that was a reason for economy to be exercised. Now, the other parts of the council have to deal with basically reading the statements from Pope St. Adrian, from the Patriarch of Jerusalem, from the Patriarch of the other patriarchs. Because remember, the other patriarchs, their view, even though they had representatives, their view was that this was Constantinople being readmitted back into the church. This is, in fact, the interesting reason that after the council was finished, and they said, this talks about the reception theory of, which is not a theory, but I think is the actual teaching of the church, of ecumenical councils, which talk about the war zone, that when the seven ecumenical councils acts were sent to Rome, Pope St. Adrian, even though his legates had approved it, Pope St. Adrian's view is that he and his bishops agreed to accept the dogmatic horos, but they would not agree to accept everything else, nor were they called the council ecumenical. They were considered an authoritative council, which brought Constantinople back to the church. Now, why did they not want to call it ecumenical, even though they agreed, or they believed the Byzantines were agreeing with their doctrinal views? Because Constantinople ignored, for very political reasons, giving back the episcopal sees and the property that had been seized in southern Italy, Sicily, in Greece, and Macedonia. And Pope St. Adrian, his view was that I can't throw St. Teresius under the bus. I'm not going to condemn this. I'm going to accept the council, and I'm just going to say, I'm just going to accept it as like kind of like a council that's true, but I'm not going to call it ecumenical. And in fact, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem, I think each had their own grievances. And even though they accepted the dogmatic horos, or rather, again, they view Constantinople as accepting their dogmatic horoses, since again, they would have thought it's not the position of Constantinople dictate to us their terms of coming back into the church. Even those patriarchs did not begin to number the Seventh Ecumenical Council as seventh, even though they accepted it as an authoritative council until like the 12th and 13th century. And some Antiochian manuscripts go to the 14th century. Though interestingly, St. Photius, when he held the 879 council, which is I accept as the eighth ecumenical council in retrospect, he complains that the four patriarchs weren't numbering the seventh council as seventh. And so when he held the council, they all agreed to call it the seventh, but no one it was never really kind of enforced. Now, the reason I bring this up also is because you have all these some historians, Anglicans, and Protestants who try to say, look, no one really accepted the Seventh Ecumenical Council except Constantinople, but it's a sleight of words, a sleight of hand. The other patriarchs accepted the veneration of images, and they had already established the Orthodox doctrine sometime before, and their view was simply that why do they have to call Constantinople's council ecumenical at the moment? They'll do it in their own good time, and everybody eventually did, and they received the council. All right, they received it, calling it ecumenical. That was the real only problem. And even in this translation by what's his name, whoever the guy did this translation, we talked about the Caroline books. That's an interesting question because one, the Caroline books are actually composed by these this letter that was written to Pope St. Adrian. And in fact, the only good thing about the notes in that translation there is that he quotes from the replies of Pope St. Adrian to the Proto-Caroline books. Where he basically refutes it. Now, the Caroline books were like kind of a systematized version of the letter to Pope St. Adrian by the supposedly by the Frankish court. I don't believe Charlemagne wrote it. I think it was written in his name. He just commissioned people to write it. I think it was done for political reasons. I think there were really probably some people who held erroneous impressions of the council. Part of the problem was generally the fact that when the Acts were translated into Latin for the first time, everybody, all historians who have studied it will tell you these were very bad translations. There's one place where the Latin translation says something like, we give divine latria to sacred images like we give to the Trinity. In fact, that's the exact opposite of what one of the creeds says. Okay, someone had translated the Greek into Latin and didn't know nuances, and they didn't know how to arrange the words, etc. And so what happens is that when this decree shows up in is sent into Gaul, there's this perplexity, to say the least, when they get these councils from what they consider to be formerly schismatic heretics, who are claiming that divine latria is given to the images like it's given to the Trinity. Now the council didn't say that. Yes, I'm sorry.
I just want to answer the other two questions that we have, and then we can get back to this real quick. Would you recommend the books of Father Seraphim Rose? I say yes. How about you, Father?
Yes. I'd say that I don't necessarily agree with every single opinion, but generally I believe he's very solid, good author.
Yeah, he's really good. He's good to recommend. I have no problem with him. Got one last question. Why true Orthodoxy or world Orthodoxy? I think we answered that question earlier with Jordan Paul's original points about what holds back conservative world Orthodox from becoming true Orthodox. The struggle in true Orthodoxy is the struggle of Orthodoxy. And it's not to put down people who are trying hard in world Orthodoxy, but the simple reality is the Orthodox ascetic struggle, the nature of it, which demands that God come first over everything else, ultimately is the struggle of Orthodoxy. And I hate to, part of the reason why that a lot of people hate the term world Orthodoxy is because it's a reminder that it's of the world. And
well, they do use the term of world Orthodoxy is used in Moscow Patriarchate publications to talk about patriarchs.
Yeah, so the point is that it also is a reminder that, we're not supposed to be of the world. We're supposed to be in it, but not of it. And I think that that's part of the reason why it's bothersome. The point is, if you want Orthodoxy unfiltered, it's pure, it's pure form, with all its wrinkles and all its flaws and difficulties, because we're human, then that's what I would. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
So my only point was, I could go more about the whole Frankish reaction and what I think is misunderstood. I think how Romanides takes it out of context. There's also the fact that once Charlemagne goes to Rome, and you really hear no more about, the Caroline books basically disappear. In fact, when Hincmar of Reims in the 870s wanted to know about the discussions about the concern that had gone on in the 780s concerning 790s concerning sacred images and their veneration, he was told by somebody that, there was some book called some book written in the name of the Emperor Charles about it, and he was like, I don't know about this. That tells you a person that tells you the fact that, in fact, there's only one manuscript or two manuscripts of the Caroline books from that period. In other words, it was written in the name of the emperor anonymously. People try to claim Alcuin. They try to claim Theodulf of Orleans. Now, Theodulf of Orleans is an interesting figure. I think he, in fact, was probably maybe behind it. And I think, in fact, he got in trouble later, because I think when Charlemagne went to Rome and he got in trouble with because he got the reply back initially from Pope Adrian, and then he went to Rome, I think on two occasions. One, he met with Pope St. Adrian, other with St. Leo III. You hear no more disputation from, as I recall, from the Carolingian court about this, because I think Charlemagne didn't really know what he was getting into. He goes to Rome, the Pope's like, oh no, this is all wrong. And he's like, talks to him personally. I think Theodulf of Orleans, in fact, he got expelled from the court of Charlemagne, by the way, when I think Louis the Pious became emperor, because they felt he exerted a negative influence upon the emperor and such. And that's my theory that I've a very quasi-proto theory I've developed for a few years, that in fact there was a clique of people who wanted to kind of take over the Frankish church. They really couldn't do it. They weren't as powerful as they thought about, and they kind of lost a lot of influence about this, because in fact, if you look at a lot of the Frankish texts, by Frankish we mean people in Gaul. Not everybody was Frankish, but saying Frankish strong. You look at Prudentius of Trier, he was a bishop. I think he died he wrote a life of someone called Saint Maura, who was a peasant woman who was a saint in the 40s. And if supposedly the Frankish bishops rejected any kind of veneration to images, then you'd have to explain why in Prudentius, the Bishop of Trier, when he wrote the life of St. Maura in the 40s, and I think St. Maura died a few years before, he would always talk about how St. Maura would come into the church and she would prostrate and kiss the image of our Lord painted on the wall and of Our Lady and all the sacred images, and she would weep tears, and how the images, there would be divine manifestations from these mosaics. And Prudentius would say nothing negative about it. He was like, this is wonderful. In fact, in 820, there was a miraculous manifestation of an icon of Our Lady in a Frankish church in Switzerland, taken as a miraculous sign that God was going to do, there was going to be some sort of people forget, whenever icons begin to shine or begin to weep, water, tears, or oil, or even blood in some cases, when that happens, either something great is going to happen, or it's a sign something bad is going to happen. All right? But you look in the Royal Frankish Annals, they don't say, oh, this demonic manifestation in this church and this Frankish. They just say, no, this was a manifestation of icon of the Virgin, and it was symbolized that something momentous was going to happen. And what was momentous to happen is what, like in 820, there was some great famine and there was a winter. And I think that may have been the one winter that Hincmar of Reims recorded in the Annals of St. Bertin, where it was like one of these rivers frozen over, and there was like these what's called a super pack of wolves formed in France, and they began to attack villages, like thousands of wolves. And they began to kill villagers everywhere, and it was a lot of interesting medieval history. But my point was that even though, going back to the concept of how the church receives councils, when you're talking about the Seventh Council, it was received in the sense of everybody accepted that is dogmatic decrees, if understood rightly, agreed with the church's decrees. All right. And that's similar to the Fifth Ecumenical Council. There were people for a long time who did not want to accept the Fifth Ecumenical Council, not because they disagreed with the condemnation of apocatastus and Nestorianism and these other heresies, but because they did not like the fact that the emperor had kidnapped Pope Vigilius. And in fact, that was why St. Isidore of Seville, or St. Leander, basically says he agrees with the dogmatic decrees, but he does not want to call the Fifth Council the Fifth, because he felt that it wasn't right for the Emperor Justinian to kidnap and cajole the Pope and other figures into accepting it, from his opinion. All right. Now, for people attack Saint Leander Isidore for saying that, I should also point out that a great Byzantine figure like the secretary of the Patriarch of Antioch, Saint Anastasius, in the 590s, Evagrius Scholasticus, he says very negative things about Justinian along the same terms. And this wasn't because they were like secretly Origenists or anything, but a lot of times people can accept decrees coming from councils, but they do not want to call it ecumenical. But that comes in times, and so, it's like after 100 years, 150 years, people just say, well, everybody who had some problem with the people who did this or that in the council is dead. We can now call it ecumenical because we already accepted it as authoritative anyway, so there's no real issue at that point. In fact, if you look at the letters of Pope St. Leo II, when he wrote to the Spanish bishops giving the acts of the Sixth Ecumenical Council, he says, will you please look at these acts, and if you find them in concord with the faith, will you accept them, because the Apostolic Roman See has accepted them. Notice he didn't say the Apostolic Roman See has accepted them, therefore you must accept them. In fact, I think it was St. Julian of maybe been Archbishop of Toledo in the 692, I'm not sure. His position and the king's position was that, look, their view was, one, why weren't we invited to this to the Sixth Ecumenical Council? They were kind of upset they weren't invited, because in Spain they had in fact held 2 synods at Toledo, in one in the 660s, I think, and maybe it was 3, 2 others in the 670s, I think, in which they in fact condemned monothelitism and monoenergism in very explicit terms. All right, and so their view is that, we'll look at it, because you got to remember Rome's reputation had kind of been damaged because of Honorius, by the way, and so not anyway. But that's kind of the understanding of the receptions at councils. People have to look at the acts. They have to see, are these in concord with the dogmatic teachings of the church? You have cases like the Persian church, for example. Anyway, okay, go ahead.
What I was going to say, Father, because we're still new at setting this up, and I just talked to NYCXS, and what they were going to do is basically kind of do a quick switch up. So we're gonna end at least the show for now, this part of it. But I want everyone to kind of stick around, because we're making a couple of changes so that we can make the stream work. And then basically we'll come back and we continue for a little bit. I
pray I didn't have any reverberation or echo issues, or none of us did.
I didn't know. Apparently, I don't think there were any echo issues, but we do have to set something up, because right now it's not set up properly. But we're going to set it up properly right now. So in any case, so at least for the next few minutes, or if you're on YouTube, this is the end of the video. You'll have to look for the next one. This is Deacon Joseph Swaden.
I'm looking at it.
And we'll be right back.